Good evening. Have you ever failed in life? Well, I know it's a bizarre way to start any talk, but can I have show of hands if you have ever failed in life at least once? For those of you who have not put up your hands, I could probably assume that you've either got lucky or you're a little too late in the day to raise your hands. And for those of you who have raised your hands today, let's travel this journey together through the valleys of failure and up the mountains of learning. This is not fair. Why me? Why not my neighbor, enemy, or someone else? Why should I have to face the unkindest cut all the time when the spoils of success brighten the faces of people around me? Lament of such sorts, friends, is not uncommon amongst all of us, right? So at some point in life, we would have gone through such a phase in life. And I know for sure that each of you here have your own failure stories to share, and that could be equally heart-wrenching. But today's talk is not about my failure or the learnings that I've had from it. Today's talk is more about understanding the dimensions of failure a little bit more in detail. What's really fascinating is that when somebody succeeds, they attribute their success to their ability or the hard work that they have put in. And at the same time, when somebody fails, they actually have 101 things to actually blame, right? But at this point is where people pause, reason, and reflect. And there seems to be some magic happening around this entire phase of reasoning and reflecting. So when we really look at failure, right, the question really is, what is really happening during the process of reasoning and reflecting? Let's all agree. Failure, there is something repugnant about failure. There is something distasteful about failure. It is also true that failure leaves an indelible mark in our personality and it bruises our ego. But at the same time, whenever somebody fails, you actually hear our own near and dear ones console us, saying that failure is the stepping stone to success, and even this too shall pass. Every time when people told me this, I had a quizzical look on my face. How does failure actually lead to success? How is something so negative actually resulting in a positive outcome, right? So that's actually, looked at, a lot of possibilities, and it gave me an irony as to how this is even possible in the first place. Not until I started my entrepreneurial journey and I embarked on my PhD journey at the same time did all of this make sense to me, right? So when I was a startup founder by the day, I used to make a lot of mistakes and I used to fail a lot. But by the evening, when I sat back, when I looked at the possibilities of what was really happening and asked myself this question, why is this happening the way it's happening? I actually started, finding a little bit more answers, if you would will. So the whole possibility, the failure has different dimensions and different walks of life, right? As a startup founder, I was told by my investors and mentors to fail fast and fail often signifying the need for me to go ahead and test my hypothesis multiple times. But when I look at the organization learning literature, specifically looking at failures across the industry, so there was so many research that talked about product failures, process failures, that talked about failures in bankruptcies, mergers and acquisitions. There was a lot of data and a lot of research done in this particular space, which gave a lot of insights on why organizations or why processes fail or why products fail, and how could one really learn from all of those. And I started getting a little bit more interest in all of that, right? So a recent publication in the Academy of Management journal synthesized all of this data across all the failures that occurred over the last 4 decades. And the researchers came up with 3 important factors. The first factor was opportunity, which characterized the availability of information at any given point in time, or the time that is required for a person to reason and reflect. The second important factor people looked at was motivation, which is one's desire to stop a failure event from happening. And the third most important factor that researchers looked at was looking at one's ability, which was characterized by, the skill sets required to identify a failure event. Though, friends, this looks pretty simple and easy, in real life, when the stakes are really, really high, it becomes extremely challenging. Let me give you an example. As a startup founder, since 2007, I always wanted to make, learning far more immersive, impactful, and fun. Way back then in 2007, serious games were never heard of. But even then, me and a couple of my friends, we wanted to build, a few games. We tried multiple attempts and we failed. In 2015, we went ahead and started a company. And even in that particular venture, we tried multiple attempts and we, failed because we contracted a gaming company, and that gaming company did not really understand the business requirements that, we actually gave them, right? But in all of these, journey where I was trying multiple conjectures of how things could work, I started failing. But I was, always asking myself this question: is there a way in which I could harness this power of learning through failure in real life, right? It's extremely important that, we know of many success stories of people relating, their failures to success. But if we are not in a position to harness or tap and make that failure really work for us, it's of no use. That's when I turned to academia to understand, how does the academic world really look at failure? To my dismay, what was considered to be actually positively related to learning in the organizational context had a very negative connotation in the academic world. In the academic world, failure was more of a taboo, right? Professors and teachers wanted to mask this entire word called failure, and they replaced it with terms like mistakes, challenges, so on and so forth, right? And every time a student failed, the larger part of the research body was most focused on, how do I really look at the psychological aspects of helping a student cope with failure and come out of this particular failure event that has occurred in his life, right? When come to think of it, the way in which a classroom is structured, the way in which the entire setup is there, it is actually not conducive for failure, right? A student does not have multiple opportunities today to actually keep trying until they learn the concepts. A professor will not be in a position, it's not practically possible to actually provide feedback to every student and, try and help them understand the gaps that they've had, when such a failure event is happening. And because of which, what's happening? The student loses motivation, and they also start not having the ability to identify failure events. So this is actually resulting in what we call a low intensity learning process. So whenever failure is actually considered to be an output, which is what is happening in today's academic world, if you realize, right? So I have an exam. At the end of an exam, I am either considered a pass or a fail based on some arbitrary cutoff that exists. And whenever there is such an event that occurs, you classify a classroom of people who have either cleared or passed or people who have failed. So in this particular process, whenever failure is being looked at as an outcome event, you naturally will have to look at coping strategies to help the student cope from those failure events from occurring. But on the other hand, I asked myself this question: is it possible for us to actually flip the entire question and start looking at failure as more of an input to a complete process where, is there a setup possible where you would be able to feed in failure as the input mechanism, allow for people to fail, give them enough information and opportunity to learn from, and actually see how the learning happens, right? So that was the question that I was actually looking at. And, it's only then, did I stumble upon various research that, is today existing on what we call as productive failure. There are researchers in Singapore and in the US today who are deliberately looking at, inducing failure as a part of the overall design process. But wait a second. we know an industry which has been using this failure loop, as we could call it, even much earlier in a much more rudimentary way, right? So I'm sure all of you would have played games, and from a game design perspective, every game has, multiple game levels. And each of these game levels have different levels of difficulty. And at each level, a particular player needs to perform a task or a mission to accomplish in that particular level, right? While doing so, you have multiple opportunities given to that particular player. Think of a game like Angry Birds, right? We know that there is an object out there that I would need to hit. I have, multiple options with me. I could change the angle. I could change the mass of the bird. I could change the force in which I move the sling to hit my target option, right? So there are multiple options that I have. There is a visual feedback cue that I get. If I either hit my object or if I don't hit my object, I do have a visual feedback instantaneously provided to me at any given point in time, right? And there is, a whole lot of reward mechanisms and microtransactions that is available for you to keep moving from one level to the other. So there is an ecosystem today that exists. But the biggest challenge with that ecosystem in the casual gaming world is that the entire learning process is not structured, and people are actually not looking at it from a far more scientific and structured way, right? I mean, obviously, a casual game that's designed for pure entertainment purposes need not focus on learning. And that was one of the biggest gaps that you still have in the entire gaming world. Though the failure learning loop is there in a much more rudimentary way, it's actually not far more structured. So this is when I, started doing a thought experiment. Let's assume that we pick up second year MBA, students from Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 colleges across India. We get them to a place and assume that we are in a position to give them a case study, for them to solve, which talks about an authentic real life problem. And you would have these students clear these case studies and, we would go ahead and then evaluate them. I'm sure you would all agree with me that on an average, you would expect students from Tier 1 college to perform much better than a Tier 2, Tier 3 college, right? It's just I'm talking about on a average sense and in a general context. I'm not talking about a very specific, instance here, right? So what really happens when you give them a case study and when they don't clear, we do classify, students from cohort B, which is from Tier 2 college, as not met the cutoff standards, and students from cohort A, which is from Tier 1 college, who has met the entire cutoff standards. So in this particular case, we have given them one opportunity to perform. We have not given them enough information as to what really transpired, because we need to give them specific information on what really went wrong. And the students would, be classified accordingly. But what I wanted to understand, if the purpose of education is not to classify people through a diagnostic test, I'm sure you would agree with me that the reason why I go to a college is for me to learn. It's not to get a tag that I've just failed in a particular course. So if the purpose of education is to actually help me learn, the question that I wanted to ask myself is, what are the conditions and ways in which colleges, which is B cohort and C cohort, which is Tier 2 and Tier 3, would start learning? So this is where we again proceeded with our experiment, where we conducted a multiplayer business simulation game, which has embedded this entire failure learning loop. I've run this particular business simulation game for almost 5,000 students the last 7 years, and the results, seem to be encouraging. In this particular simulation, you would have, students don the hats of multiple, business heads, and they would start making decisions like how a manager would make decisions in real world. But what, is fascinating is that, as predicted, students from cohort A who belong to Tier 1 college were able to meet the cutoff with much lesser opportunity, while students from the Tier 2 college and Tier 3 college, when you increase the opportunity and when you increase the availability of information, you exactly now know at what cutoff levels, at what opportunity levels, and what information levels would they be in a position to learn and meet the entire cutoff. So this actually opens up an interesting way of actually looking at learning. We further asked the students to record their learning whenever they had played this particular game. So at every instance, we asked students from cohort A, B, and C to record their learning consistently, and the thematic understanding of what people learned, irrespective of the college they came from, which is your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 college, remained the same. So which means to say that that learning is actually happening by virtue of looking at what they have learned, and you also understand that now exactly at what levels of opportunity and information will I be able to match a tier 2 college student with a tier 1 college student. We further did, a lot of regression and correlations where we looked at their motivation levels, we looked at the, opportunity levels and attribution levels, right? In the entire failure learning literature, what's more important is whom do I attribute my failure to? If you would actually realize, I talked about ability, and ability is one's nature to identify a failure event. So if I, as an individual who is going through a particular transaction, I'm not able to identify if I failed or not, then my learning, suffers. So this is where we, started looking at the attribution, looked at attribution theory of whom, do they really attribute their success or failure to, and look at their overall learning outcomes. And the results of that, were quite, promising. So in a nutshell, what are we actually saying? So with improvements or with drastic changes in cognitive psychology, and with the advent of newer technologies like, ChatGPT or any of the AI models, we could now look at failure learning loops in a far more interesting way. So instead of actually looking at failure as an outcome event, we now would be in a position to design for failure in each of the pedagogical approaches that we create. So imagine a world in a game where you have been given an entire world which mirrors an authentic learning setup, where you have multiple opportunities to actually perform in that particular world. Imagine the AI engine, which is your ChatGPT, being a virtual mentor who will be in a position to provide you exact feedback on what really went wrong at the point in which you are committing a particular mistake, right? And more importantly, when such an event happens, you will be in a position to start capturing evidences of what people say and do within that particular learning network to make inferences about their skill sets and proficiencies. And since we're talking, a game, you could look at microtransactions and rewards to help them, overcome some of the blockers in terms of their motivation levels and get them to the next, stage, as they move. So friends, while the common wisdom really talks about, failure as the stepping stone for success, it's not sufficient we actually leave that to chance. If we know that, failure has led to successes in multiple people across the world, is there a possibility that we could actually factor that in our learning process? That's the question that we are trying to ask here, right? And if failure is so important for learning, it can't be a setup where I'm afraid to fail. You can't have an environment where you are actually not making friends with failure. So it's important that if we are reimagining EdTech, we also would need to reimagine the way in which people learn, and especially people learning from failure. Thank you so much.